On August 6 AD 1806, one of the oldest political orders in Europe did not perish in a final siege. No capital was taken in a last apocalyptic assault. No emperor was hauled from a throne before a cheering conqueror. No single battlefield delivered the theatrical ending later generations prefer. The Holy Roman Empire ended because Emperor Francis II declared it ended. He renounced the imperial crown, released the imperial estates from their obligations, and brought a tradition associated with nearly 1,000 years of European history to a legal close. That is the first surprise. The second is more important. This was not simply collapse. It was calculation under extreme pressure. The end of the Holy Roman Empire was not the story of one battle, however famous. It was the story of military success converted into diplomatic leverage converted into constitutional rearrangement, and constitutional rearrangement converted into political death. Cannon broke resistance. Diplomacy redistributed status. Law ratified the new reality. The sword forced open the structure, but paper decided who still belonged inside it. That is why this episode matters. Not because an old empire vanished, but because it vanished in a way that feels startlingly modern. The destruction of the Reich was not merely physical. It was institutional. It was psychological. It was strategic. An ancient order was not simply overrun. Its claims to obedience were redirected, its internal map was rewritten, and its own head of state concluded that preserving the title had become more dangerous than extinguishing it. I am Professor Adrian Lockwell, and this is Archives of Humanity. Tonight, the grand chessboard of Europe does not open as a parade of uniforms, flags, and battlefield spectacle. It opens as an investigation into power in its most subtle form, legitimacy. Why do human beings obey certain institutions for centuries, then abandon them with astonishing speed? Why do some systems survive repeated shocks, only to fail when confronted by a new style of war and a new logic of politics? Because the title of this episode is exact. The Empire that Dissolved Itself. The central mystery is not simply why Napoleon defeated Austria, nor even why France dominated Germany for a critical moment. The deeper question is far stranger. Why did a political order conventionally traced to Otto I in 8962 survive feudal fragmentation, dynastic feuds, struggles with the papacy, confessional division, the Reformation, and the devastation of the 30 Years' War, yet fail in the Napoleonic age? Why then? Why under Francis II? Why by signature rather than siege? The answer lies in several forces converging at once. First, structural fragility. The Holy Roman Empire had become extraordinarily skilled at accommodating variety. Princes, bishops, cities, electors, local rights, layered jurisdictions, negotiated sovereignties. That complexity had once been a strength. It distributed power, moderated conflict, and allowed the empire to endure where simpler systems might have shattered. But structures designed for negotiation can become dangerously slow when confronted by an age that rewards concentration, speed, and coercive coordination. Second, revolutionary warfare. France after 1789 was not merely another rival monarchy with another army in the field. It represented a transformation in political energy, mobilization, administration, and military tempo. States were now expected to raise more men, move faster, tax deeper, and fuse political purpose with military action more aggressively than many 18th century dynasties had ever imagined possible. The old European game did not simply continue with new players. The rules themselves were changing. Third, Habsburg survival strategy. Francis II was not a sleepwalking relic presiding over a museum piece. He was a dynast confronting a brutal strategic question. If the imperial framework could no longer be defended as it once had been, what must be sacrificed so that the Habsburg monarchy itself could survive? That distinction matters. The fall of the Holy Roman Empire was not identical to the fall of Austria. One political body could die so that another might live. And fourth, Napoleon's mastery of legitimacy politics. Much is said, rightly, about his operational brilliance, his speed, his organizational genius, and his talent for breaking coalitions. But one of his sharpest weapons was political recognition itself. He understood rank. He understood prestige. He understood that German rulers could be detached from old loyalties not only by fear, but by reward. Titles could be elevated. Territories could be enlarged. Dependence could be made to look like promotion. Napoleon did not need to destroy every institution by frontal assault if he could make obedience migrate elsewhere. That is the hidden blade in this story. Institutions do not live on antiquity alone. They live because people continue to believe that their offices matter, that their laws bind, and that their hierarchies still organize real power. Once belief weakens, force must compensate. And if force is divided, delayed, or politically constrained, then even a millennium-old order may discover that it still possesses ceremony but no longer commands decisions. Napoleon saw this with cold clarity. Francis understood it with growing dread. The German princes adapted to it with varying degrees of opportunism. Europe at large was still speaking the language of inherited legitimacy while entering a harsher century in which institutions would increasingly be judged by their ability to coordinate power at speed. So this is not merely a battle story, though battles will matter. It is not merely the story of Austerlitz, though Austerlitz will cast a long shadow. It is the story of how a constitutional organism was hollowed out, how loyalty was rerouted, how legal form became a weapon, and how an emperor chose controlled dissolution over symbolic captivity. There is, finally, one irony that frames everything that follows. The Holy Roman Empire had long been mocked as cumbersome, fragmented, and excessively ceremonial. Yet those same qualities had once helped it survive. Flexibility had been its armor. Negotiation had been its method of endurance. The problem was not that the empire had always been absurd. The problem was that Europe entered an age in which the very traits that had once preserved it could now be exploited against it. And that is where the inquiry must move next. Before tracing Napoleon's victories or Francis's decision, the empire itself must be seen clearly. What exactly was the Holy Roman Empire, and why have so many later observers misunderstood the political creature that stood at the center of Germany for centuries? The first obstacle is conceptual. The Holy Roman Empire is often judged by standards it was never designed to meet. It was not a nation-state waiting to be born, nor a failed version of France, Britain, or Russia. It was a different political species altogether, a constitutional civilization spread across Central Europe, old enough to carry medieval ideas of universal order, yet flexible enough to survive into the age of gunpowder and finance. Its conventional starting point is AD 962, when Otto I was crowned emperor. That date matters not because a perfectly unified state suddenly appeared, but because it anchored a durable claim. That in the center of Europe there existed an imperial office meant to protect Christendom, preserve public order, and give political hierarchy a sacred and legal frame. The title looked back to Rome, but it operated through medieval realities. From the beginning, the empire was less a machine of command than a structure of recognition. That distinction is everything. The empire did have an emperor, but the emperor did not rule a uniform block of territory from a single capital with direct authority over all subjects. Power was layered. Beneath and around the imperial crown stood prince-electors, whose right to choose the emperor gave the office both legitimacy and limits. There were secular princes ruling duchies, margraviates, and counties. There were bishops and abbots who were not merely churchmen, but territorial lords with revenues, courts, and political leverage. There were imperial knights, small in land but significant in legal status. And there were free imperial cities, commercially powerful communities that answered directly to the emperor rather than to a regional prince. To a modern mind trained to expect clean borders and singular sovereignty, this arrangement can seem irrational. It was not. It was negotiated sovereignty. Overlapping rights, inherited privileges, local jurisdictions, and carefully defended immunities. Authority existed in layers because Central Europe itself existed in layers. Geography, dynastic marriages, ecclesiastical possessions, urban liberties, and feudal claims had produced a crowded political landscape. The empire did not erase that complexity. It organized it. This is why the old joke that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire is memorable but misleading. It flatters modern simplicity. In reality, the empire performed difficult work for centuries. Its decentralization dispersed power across many estates and jurisdictions, which often prevented any single faction from mastering the German lands outright. More importantly, it created channels through which rivalry could be processed without always becoming annihilation. That was not absurdity. That was constitutional strategy. Its institutions reveal the logic. The imperial diet was not a parliament in the modern democratic sense, but it was a forum in which the estates of the empire deliberated, negotiated, and formalized collective decisions. The imperial circles, created to organize large regions, helped coordinate defense, taxation, and administrative responsibilities in a realm too vast and fragmented for crude central command. The imperial courts, above all the Reichskammergericht and the Aulic Council, gave rulers, cities, and lesser estates legal avenues to contest power. In other words, the empire replaced some measure of arbitrary violence with procedure. It converted friction into law often enough to endure. that endurance depended on accepting slowness as a price of coexistence. A centralized monarchy could move faster. The empire could absorb more difference. In a Europe of strong local identities, poor communications, and persistent dynastic competition, that was not a minor advantage. It is easy for later centuries to confuse speed with strength. Yet for long stretches of European history, systems survived not by forcing total obedience, but by making limited cooperation possible among rivals who distrusted one another. The Holy Roman Empire excelled at exactly that. Over time, one family became the habitual manager of this elaborate order, the Habsburgs. The imperial title was elective, not automatically hereditary, but Habsburg prestige became so entrenched that the crown and the dynasty were increasingly intertwined. This brought continuity, ceremony, and diplomatic weight. It also created a permanent tension. The emperor was supposed to stand for the empire as a whole, yet the Habsburg ruler also defended dynastic interests in Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and beyond. The office that symbolized balance was repeatedly occupied by one of the system's strongest players. That ambiguity could be managed in stable times. It became dangerous in revolutionary times. The Peace of Westphalia in AD 1648 sharpened this constitutional reality. Westphalia did not abolish the empire, codified it more clearly. After AD 1648, the imperial estates held stronger recognized rights, and the emperor's ability to impose unified action became more constrained. The empire remained real, but increasingly as a legal and diplomatic framework rather than a single military actor. It still conferred legitimacy. It still shaped rank, rights, and political process. But it was no longer well-suited to act with the concentrated force later generations would associate with sovereignty. And inside Germany, another problem was hardening. Austria and Prussia emerged as rival centers of power. This Austro-Prussian dualism did not destroy the empire outright, but it narrowed its freedom of action. Vienna could not easily convert imperial authority into decisive leadership without alarming Berlin. Prussia could not seek primacy without colliding with Habsburg interests. The result was paralysis at the very top of the German political world. The empire still had legitimacy, memory, and law. What it increasingly lacked was uncontested strategic direction. Even so, Europe had reasons to value its existence. The empire acted as buffer space in the center of the continent. It offered a recognized hierarchy that reduced the diplomatic chaos of hundreds of competing claims. And it restrained total domination in Central Europe by making the German world difficult to absorb into any single power bloc. For neighbors and rivals alike, that mattered. The Holy Roman Empire was not merely a German curiosity. It was part of the continental balance. But balances survive only when the age still rewards their logic. An order built to mediate complexity was now approaching an era that rewarded concentration, speed, fiscal extraction, and ideological mobilization. Once that new age arrived, the empire's greatest historical strength would begin to look, to friend and enemy alike, like strategic delay. That is the threshold Europe was crossing. A different kind of pressure was now entering Central Europe, and the Holy Roman Empire was poorly designed for it. When war broke out in AD 1792, many courts first treated the crisis as if it belonged to the familiar world of dynastic rivalry. Kings, ministers, and diplomats still thought in the language of succession, frontier adjustment, and balance of power bargaining. But revolutionary France was not merely another monarchy fighting with new slogans. It was beginning to fight with a new political engine. Older European warfare had usually been conducted by professional armies serving limited aims. States fought for fortresses, border districts, trade leverage, or dynastic claims. Even when the bloodshed was immense, the logic remained comparatively narrow. War was an affair of rulers, financed by court systems, constrained by logistics, and moderated by the fact that most governments could not easily summon the full energy of society. The French Revolution began to tear away those limits. The levy en masse was the clearest sign of the change. Military service could now be justified not simply as obedience to a king, but as duty to a political nation. That shift mattered enormously. It expanded the reservoir of manpower, but it also transformed the emotional structure of war. France could claim that armies were defending a revolution, a people, a future. Ideology gave conflict a sharper moral edge. Administrative centralization gave it speed. A more aggressive fiscal military state gave it reach. Taxation, requisition, propaganda, recruitment, and command became parts of one larger machine. This also altered the social composition of command. Revolutionary and then early Napoleonic France did not abolish hierarchy, but it did widen the pathways of advancement compared with the old aristocratic norm. Merit, energy, and political reliability could elevate men who would have remained marginal in a stricter court order. that gave France a broader talent pool at the very moment it was mobilizing armies on a scale the old regime had rarely sustained. Europe was no longer confronting merely a stronger army. It was confronting a state that had discovered how to convert society itself into strategic power. That was precisely the kind of development the empire found hardest to answer. The Holy Roman Empire had been built to reconcile plural authorities, preserve legal balances, and slow the concentration of power. For centuries, that had been a source of resilience. It prevented too much from depending on one center. It dispersed ambition. It mediated conflict. But now Europe was entering an age that rewarded concentrated decision-making, rapid mobilization, and political simplification. No region revealed this tension more clearly than the Rhineland. The Rhine was not simply a river frontier. It was the empire's western pressure point, where geography, commerce, law, and war all collided. The territories along and west of the Rhine formed a dense political mosaic. Bishoprics, abbeys, imperial cities, secular principalities, and overlapping jurisdictions. In an earlier age, that complexity had helped absorb shocks. In the age of Revolutionary War, it became a strategic liability. French armies could advance against a frontier that was politically fragmented, while the imperial response had to pass through layers of consultation, estate privilege, dynastic calculation, and regional interest. French campaigns moved at military speed. Imperial coordination moved at constitutional speed. This was not a matter of stupidity or cowardice. It was a structural mismatch. Coalition after coalition resisted France, yet the old imperial framework could not reliably generate a unified modern response. The Reich still possessed legal dignity, but legal dignity is not the same as operational coherence. That distinction would become fatal. The diplomatic settlements of these years exposed the weakness step by step. The Treaty of Campo Formio in AD 1797, concluded after Austria's defeats in Italy, was a warning shot far beyond the Italian theater. It showed that imperial space could be rearranged through great power bargaining in ways that increasingly bypassed the empire's own internal constitutional logic. A principle was being established. The map of the Reich could be altered from the outside when military force created the leverage. The Treaty of Luneville in AD 1801 drove the lesson deeper. Austria accepted France's possession of the left bank of the Rhine. That was not merely territorial loss. It was territorial dislocation on an imperial scale. Lands, revenues, jurisdictions, and status positions vanished at once. And the surrender of those lands immediately produced a second crisis inside Germany: compensation for the rulers who had lost them. Once compensation became necessary, the internal order of the empire became negotiable. That negotiation culminated in the Reichsdeputationsschluss of AD 1803, one of the most consequential constitutional reorganizations in German history. The term is cumbersome, but the reality was brutal in its clarity. Ecclesiastical territories were secularized on a vast scale. Prince-bishoprics, abbeys, and church lordships that had long formed essential elements of the imperial balance were dissolved or absorbed. Many free imperial cities were mediatized, losing the immediacy and autonomy that had tied them directly to the imperial order. The political map was drastically simplified. But simplification did not mean renewal. It meant that an old equilibrium had been broken under pressure from outside force and internal redistribution. The empire lost not only territories, but also institutions that had anchored its balance for centuries. Ecclesiastical rulers disappeared from the constitutional equation. Urban independence shrank. Larger territorial states emerged strengthened. Smaller units vanished. Revenue streams changed hands. Networks of patronage and protection were uprooted. Germany was being redesigned before the final crisis had even arrived. That is why AD 1803 must be understood as a constitutional earthquake, not an administrative footnote. The empire that would face Napoleon's later triumphs was already altered in structure, habit, and expectation. Napoleon did not create this transformation from nothing. He inherited a system already wounded by revolutionary warfare and then recognized its strategic potential. The logic was cold, but brilliant. A Germany reduced to fewer, larger, and more reward-dependent states was easier for France to manage than the older labyrinth of ecclesiastical territories, civic republics, and layered legal bodies. Princes who gained land, rank, and prestige through French-backed settlements had strong reasons to look toward Paris rather than toward the older imperial center. Reward could purchase alignment. Elevation could redirect loyalty. Dependency could be turned into policy. By AD 1804, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, the ground beneath the Reich had already shifted. The frontier was compromised. The constitutional map had been redrawn. The balance among estates had been disturbed. The habits that once made the system workable were beginning to fail under the demands of a new age. What followed would not be the destruction of an intact order, but the exploitation of an order already destabilized from the Rhine inward. And once the structure had been weakened at that depth, the next question was no longer abstract. It became a question of rulers, calculations, and timing. Who understood what had changed, who hoped the old formulas still applied, and who would learn too late that Europe was now being governed by a harsher mathematics of power. The crisis now moved from institutions to individuals. And that shift matters because ancient systems rarely die in abstraction. They die when the people charged with preserving them begin making rational choices inside an irrational structure. Napoleon Bonaparte was the most dangerous mind on the board precisely because he understood that war was no longer separate from political design. After AD 1799, first as first consul and then, after AD 1804 as Emperor of the French, he assembled something Europe had not yet learned how to answer. A state that could decide quickly, move quickly, and convert military success into legal and diplomatic transformation before its enemies had even finished interpreting the battlefield. His ambitions were larger than conquest in the old dynastic sense. He wanted strategic depth against future coalitions. He wanted prestige equal to the ancient houses that still treated him as an upstart. He wanted a dynastic order that could survive beyond his own campaigns. And he wanted Germany, above all, removed from the hands of hostile coalitions and reorganized into a controllable political zone. In older centuries, the German lands had been a maze that frustrated domination. Napoleon saw that the same fragmentation could be turned into an instrument. Princes rewarded by France could serve him more reliably than provinces merely occupied by force. That was the essence of his power. He did not simply defeat states, he rearranged incentives. Rank, territory, recognition, and protection became weapons. A ruler elevated by Napoleon had every reason to treat French success as the foundation of his own future. Francis too faced the same crisis from the opposite direction. Posterity often reduces him to the last emperor of a dying order, as though he simply watched events pass over him. That misses the calculation. Francis was not only Holy Roman Emperor. He was also head of the Habsburg monarchy, and by the early 19th century those roles no longer aligned cleanly. To preserve the imperial constitution at all costs might expose Austria itself to destruction. To abandon the imperial claim too quickly would mean surrendering centuries of hierarchy, legitimacy, and influence inside Germany. His creation of the Austrian Empire in AD 1804 was therefore not decorative vanity. It was a hedge. Francis understood that if the Holy Roman imperial title were stripped of substance, the Habsburg dynasty still needed an unquestioned imperial dignity of its own. In effect, he built a second throne before the first one collapsed. That decision reveals a great deal about Vienna's realism. Beneath the language of continuity, the Habsburg court was already preparing for a world in which the Reich might survive in name only, or not survive at all. Then there was Tsar Alexander I of Russia, a ruler whose motives were sincere, elevated, competitive, and unstable all at once. He opposed French predominance for reasons of balance, prestige, and principle, but those motives did not always reinforce one another. Alexander wanted Russia to be indispensable to Europe, not merely present within it. He wished to appear as defender of continental order, arbiter among powers, and a monarch of historic significance in his own right. The danger in such a posture is obvious. When a ruler's moral self-image fuses with strategic ambition, coalition politics becomes vulnerable to theatricality. Prestige begins to shape choices that should be governed by timing, logistics, and command discipline. Prussia offered a different kind of weakness. Hesitation elevated into policy. Berlin feared France's speed and military effectiveness. It feared Austrian influence in Germany. It feared isolation if it chose wrongly. And it feared paying the price for a war whose political rewards others might harvest. So Prussia postponed. It waited for clarity, for leverage, for a safer hour. But in a system changing this fast, delay was not neutrality. It was surrendering initiative to others. Every month of indecision allowed France, Austria, and Russia to redefine the strategic environment while Prussia continued debating what future it preferred. Below the great courts, the German middle powers were making calculations of their own. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and many lesser rulers were not simply passive victims awaiting dismemberment. They could see that the old imperial balance was eroding. Ecclesiastical states were being secularized. Free cities were losing insulation. Status itself was becoming negotiable. Under those conditions, alignment with France could appear not treacherous but prudent. Napoleon could offer land, elevation in rank, royal dignity, and relief from older imperial constraints. Opportunism in such a moment was not moral confusion. It was political adaptation. This is the point where Napoleonic warfare must be understood as more than battlefield talent. The core system gave France unusual operational freedom. Separate formations could move on parallel routes, sustain themselves across a wider space, and converge with speed at decisive moments. Flexible subcommand allowed marshals to act within a broader design instead of waiting helplessly for every instruction. Above all, centralized political authority in Paris meant that military operations and state objectives were synchronized. France could fight, negotiate, intimidate, reward, and reorganize in one continuous sequence. Napoleon's genius was not simply movement, it was integration. He did not see war first and settlement later. He treated campaigns as engines for diplomatic restructuring and diplomacy as preparation for the next campaign. His enemies suffered from the opposite condition. Coalition warfare looked formidable because it combined armies, treasuries, and prestige. In practice, it often multiplied friction. Commands were divided between courts with different priorities. Communications moved slowly across great distances. Intelligence was filtered by vanity, fear, and the instinct to avoid blame. Generals defended honor as fiercely as position. Monarchs intervened in plans they only partly understood. Every Allied government asked how France might be defeated, but also who would dominate Europe afterward if France fell. That second question weakened the first. Austria feared bleeding for a settlement that favored Russia. Russia feared entanglement in continental calculations that served Austrian recovery more than Russian interests. Prussia feared commitment at the wrong moment. The smaller German states feared becoming bargaining chips in other men's designs. France, by contrast, possessed something more decisive than numerical certainty: unity of political direction. That asymmetry would soon become fatal. Once armies began to move, systems of decision would reveal their true quality. A command structure built for speed would collide with alliances built on consultation, rivalry, and delay. And on that collision, the fate of Germany would begin to harden into military reality. In AD 1805, diplomatic alignment met the brutal mathematics of operational speed. The Third Coalition brought Britain, Austria, and Russia into common cause against France, but common cause did not mean common tempo. Austria moved first, and that decision exposed the central weakness of coalition war. One ally could be in motion while the others were still becoming ready. General Karl Mack advanced into Bavaria with a forward strategy built on assumptions that belonged to an older military world. The Austrian idea was clear enough: move quickly, concentrate around Ulm, secure a strong position on the Danube, and hold until Russian armies arrived to turn a local stand into a broader coalition effort. In 18th century terms, that logic was respectable. Armies moved by magazine lines, sovereigns thought in stages, and time itself was expected to cushion mistakes. Napoleon was now fighting in a way that treated time not as a cushion, but as a weapon. The Grande Armée had been assembled near the Channel coast for the threatened invasion of Britain. Then it swung east with extraordinary speed. This was not merely a rapid march. It was a demonstration of a new operational system. Napoleon's corps moved on separate roads, gathered intelligence across a broad front, lived more flexibly off the land and local supply, and could concentrate at the decisive point without waiting for one enormous mass to crawl forward together. What older armies achieved through rigid concentration, he increasingly achieved through coordinated dispersion. From a distance, it looked like movement. In practice, it was command superiority. Mack expected the French to come through the Black Forest in a more predictable frontal approach. Instead, Napoleon crossed the Rhine, wheeled north of the main Austrian position, and drove toward the Danube crossings behind Mack. The result was the Ulm campaign, one of the most devastating examples of operational encirclement in modern history. French forces did not need a grand day of annihilation. They needed to close routes, distort Austrian expectations, and make every report arrive too late. Dispatches contradicted one another. Units lost their sense of the whole. Assumptions hardened into fatal errors. That is why Ulm mattered far beyond the surrender itself. By October, Mack's army was surrounded and forced to capitulate with tens of thousands of men lost to the coalition without a climactic set-piece battle. The shock was intellectual as much as military. Europe had seen armies beaten before. Ulm suggested something more dangerous: that a competent army could be rendered irrelevant before it ever fought the battle it thought it was preparing for. Coalition planning depended on time for correction, for junction with allies, for political reconsideration. Napoleon was destroying that time. The consequences ran upward immediately. If an army could collapse at the operational level this quickly, then the cabinet systems behind it were also in danger. Alliances built for slower wars suddenly looked exposed. Ulm did not simply wreck an Austrian field force. It discredited the coalition's method. It showed that courage, prestige, and formal alliance commitments could be outpaced by an enemy whose command structure turned movement into strategic surprise. The road to Vienna opened. Napoleon entered the Habsburg capital in November, and the psychological effect was immense. Vienna was not merely a useful city or a seasonal objective. It was one of the great political centers of dynastic Europe, heavy with ceremonial authority and imperial memory. Its occupation signaled that the Habsburg monarchy could no longer rely on inherited stature to buy time for recovery. The capital had been reached before coalition coordination had matured. That fact alone announced that the old rhythm of European war was breaking down. Yet the campaign was still unresolved. Russian forces remained in the field, and Tsar Alexander I, together with Francis II, still sought a decisive confrontation. That confrontation came on December 2 AD 1805 at Austerlitz. There Napoleon transformed battlefield deception into political shock. He entered the battle with calculated vulnerability. He allowed his right to appear weak. He surrendered the Pratzen Heights, the dominant central ground, and let the Allied command believe that the French center had been thinned and that the road to a decisive turning movement lay open. This was not theatrical recklessness. It was controlled inducement. The Allied high command, especially around Alexander, was already vulnerable to overconfidence, to the emotional need to reverse humiliation, and to the courtly temptation to prefer boldness over caution. Kutuzov's restraint carried less influence than the prestige of action. The Allied plan, largely associated with Franz von Weyrother, committed major forces against Napoleon's right in the belief that the French flank could be rolled up. On paper, it promised a grand result. In execution, it drained strength from the center, stretched coordination across difficult timing, and magnified every weakness of coalition command. Too many authorities, too many assumptions, uneven intelligence, and too much faith that a written design could survive the first shock of reality. Napoleon waited for the center to thin. Then he struck. Soult's corps surged into the Pratzen Heights and split the Allied army at its hinge. That was the battle. Once the center broke, the coalition attack ceased to be an offensive operation and became a disconnected struggle for survival. What looked like Allied initiative had been shaped into self-exposure. Austerlitz is often described as genius, and rightly so, but the deeper explanation is structural. Napoleon's staff work translated intention into motion faster than his opponents could react. His core system gave him flexibility without fragmentation. His subordinates operated within a shared design rather than as isolated instruments awaiting constant rescue. Deception was fused with command. Against him stood a coalition hampered by divided authority, prestige politics, and slower institutional reflexes. France did not simply win because it fought harder. It won because it processed war more coherently. The diplomatic harvest followed in the Treaty of Pressburg at the end of AD 1805. Austria lost territory, influence, and bargaining strength. More importantly, Napoleon rewarded his German clients. Bavaria and Württemberg rose in status. Baden was elevated. French power in Germany now wore legal clothing and dynastic legitimacy. This was the true conversion of victory. Ulm and Austerlitz had not only broken armies, they had given Napoleon the authority to redistribute rank, reward obedience, and alter the political hierarchy of the German world. From that point forward, the danger to the old imperial order became far greater than military defeat alone. Victory had become patronage, and patronage was becoming a new map of loyalty. Victory on the battlefield was only the opening transaction. The deeper operation began when Napoleon converted military success into a reordering of legitimacy itself. Germany was no longer being pressured merely by French armies. It was being rewritten by French patronage. The old imperial world had rested on ancient law, inherited precedents, negotiated privilege, and habit. Napoleon introduced a harsher arithmetic. Reward those who aligned, isolate those who hesitated, and make allegiance flow toward the power that could actually deliver rank, security, and expansion. In that context, Francis's decision in AD 1804 takes on a colder meaning. When he proclaimed the Austrian Empire and assumed the title Emperor of Austria, this was not vanity draped in ceremony. It was strategic insurance. For centuries, Habsburg dignity had been intertwined with the Holy Roman imperial crown, but Francis could see what many still hoped to deny. The Reich might not survive the age that had arrived. If Napoleon could hollow out the imperial constitution while preserving its shell, then the Habsburgs risked losing not only influence but dynastic altitude. Austria therefore needed a sovereign identity that did not depend on the old German framework. The Austrian Empire was, in effect, a lifeboat prepared before the vessel had fully split. It acknowledged, quietly but unmistakably, that the constitutional death of the Reich was no longer unthinkable. Then came the Treaty of Pressburg at the end of AD 1805, the diplomatic harvest of Austerlitz. Its significance cannot be measured only in miles of territory lost. Pressburg weakened Austrian standing inside Germany at the level that mattered most: prestige, hierarchy, and political gravity. Habsburg authority had long depended on more than force of arms. It depended on the assumption that the emperor still occupied the summit of a recognized order. Pressburg struck directly at that assumption. Austria surrendered lands, yes, but Napoleon also elevated his German partners. Bavaria and Württemberg were raised to kingship. Baden was advanced in rank as a Grand Duchy. These were not decorative compliments. In the diplomatic language of the early 19th century, status was power made visible. A ruler who received a crown from Napoleon did not simply gain splendor. He gained a new source of legitimacy, and that legitimacy pointed toward Paris. This was the strategic brilliance of indirect control. Annexation burdens an empire with occupation, administration, supply, and rebellion. Reclassification is cheaper and, under the right conditions, far more effective. Napoleon did not need to absorb most German states into France. He needed them to cease behaving as estates within an imperial constitution and begin acting as clients within a French design system. That was the key move. He changed not every border, but the meaning of obedience. He altered the direction in which thrones looked for protection, advantage, and recognition. Rank itself became an instrument of conquest. It is easy to dismiss the German princes as opportunists intoxicated by French victory. That explanation is morally satisfying and analytically weak. Their conduct was rational within the world that had emerged. The Holy Roman Empire was slow, juridical, layered, and consultative. Those qualities had once allowed it to endure by moderating conflict and distributing power. But in a revolutionary age shaped by operational speed and concentrated decision, the same qualities could look like paralysis. Napoleon offered guarantees, titles, territorial enlargement, and immediate relevance. The Reich offered procedure. When survival and advancement depended on choosing which political machine could act, many rulers chose the one that moved. That logic became formal in July AD 1806 with the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine. A group of German states, under French protection, seceded from the Holy Roman Empire and entered a new order whose real center stood outside the old imperial constitution. The phrase itself sounds technical, almost harmless. In reality, it was a constitutional amputation. Protection meant hierarchy. It meant military obligation to France. It meant external alignment in foreign affairs. Above all, it meant that the axis of loyalty had shifted. Once that happened, the empire was not merely shrinking. It was being deprived of the obedience that gave it meaning. That point is essential. The Holy Roman Empire was not a centralized nation-state held together by a single bureaucracy, a unified treasury, or a national army. It was a legal and political organism sustained by recognized relationships of duty among emperor, electors, princes, cities, and estates. Its authority existed because those within it accepted the framework as lawful, customary, and worth maintaining. Once major princes withdrew and transferred their allegiance to a French-protected bloc, the imperial structure was wounded at its foundation. A system built on layered recognition cannot survive when those layers are detached and reattached elsewhere. Napoleon understood this with remarkable precision. He was not simply battering the Reich from outside. He was inducing its components to defect from within. That is why his power in Germany exceeded the reach of his bayonets alone. He fused military intimidation with legal innovation and diplomatic theater. The message to German rulers was unmistakable. Remain within an imperial shell that could no longer defend status or deliver advantage, or enter a new order in which rewards were immediate and French protection made them real. The message to Francis was even more severe. The imperial form might remain, but only as a powerless fiction living under French supremacy. Or it could disappear altogether. This was violence expressed in diplomatic grammar. Napoleon made law behave like siege warfare. He did not need to storm every fortress if he could persuade the gatekeepers to change masters. He did not need to destroy every institution outright if he could make its members conclude that obedience elsewhere was safer, richer, and more rational. That is the mechanism so often missed. The Holy Roman Empire did not fall simply because it was old, and not simply because it had lost battles. It fell because its constitutional map was rearranged faster than its institutions could respond. The machinery of consultation, precedence, and legal adaptation had once been a source of resilience. Under Napoleonic pressure, it became fatal delay. By the time the empire could register the scale of the transformation, the loyalties that sustained it had already been transferred. The title still remained. The ceremonies still remained. The language of empire still remained. But beneath the parchment, the obedience had drained away, and with that evaporation, only one decision of consequence was left to the man who still wore the crown. Then came the decision that made the death of the empire official. On August 6, AD 1806, Francis II issued the declaration that ended the Holy Roman Empire. He renounced the imperial crown, declared himself released from the obligations attached to the office, and, more importantly, released the imperial estates, princes, officials, and subjects from the duties that had bound them to the Reich. With that act, a political order whose continuity had stretched back to the coronation of Otto I in AD 962 did not collapse in a final siege. It was dissolved by the very ruler who still possessed its highest title. That fact can be mistaken for mere surrender. It was more severe than surrender, and in a narrow strategic sense more intelligent. Francis was not preserving honor. He was managing ruin. By the summer of AD 1806, the imperial constitution had already been gutted by realities it could no longer master. The Confederation of the Rhine, created under Napoleon's protection in July, had drawn a cluster of German princes out of the imperial framework altogether. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and other states had shifted the source of their political future. Their advancement no longer depended on imperial law or imperial arbitration. It depended on French favor, French guarantees, and French power. That changed the meaning of the imperial title itself. A crown that cannot command obedience becomes vulnerable to appropriation. So long as a Holy Roman Emperor continued to exist, Napoleon had every reason to exploit the shell of the institution. He could leave the old facade standing while stripping it of independent force. He could use its prestige while ensuring that its decisions flowed from French leverage. He could turn Francis into the custodian of a humiliation staged before all Europe. In other words, to keep the title under those conditions was not to save the empire. It was to preserve a legal theater in which Napoleon might appear as the true arbiter of Germany, while the emperor remained only as decoration. That is why the Habsburg move of AD 1804 now appears in its full clarity. Francis had already assumed the title Francis I, Emperor of Austria. At the time, that looked to some observers like dynastic inflation, an extra crown for the sake of prestige. It was nothing of the kind. It was an insurance policy against constitutional extinction. If the Holy Roman Empire could no longer be defended, then the Habsburg monarchy required another basis of legitimacy, one that did not depend on the obedience of dozens of semi-autonomous imperial estates or the survival of a medieval legal order. The Old Empire and the Austrian Empire were not interchangeable. One was a layered constitutional organism spread across Central Europe. The other was a dynastic state the Habsburgs could actually govern, tax, defend, and reform. So the crucial distinction must be kept sharp. The Holy Roman Empire ended in AD 1806. Habsburg power did not. Francis ceased to be Holy Roman Emperor, but he remained Emperor of Austria. The universal claim vanished. The dynasty endured. That was the hard core of the decision. Francis could not rescue the Reich, but he could prevent the Habsburg house from going down with it. The immediate consequences were immense, especially for the smaller actors who had long lived under the empire's legal canopy. Imperial estates lost the formal superior authority to which appeals, obligations, and rights had once been attached. Free imperial cities, already weakened by the mediatizations and secularizations of AD 1803, saw the remaining constitutional ground beneath them crumble even further. Imperial knights and minor jurisdictions, which had survived for centuries inside the Reich's intricate web of privilege and procedure, now stood exposed before larger neighboring states with far fewer restraints. The imperial courts, above all the Reichskammergericht, did not need to be theatrically stormed. They were neutralized by a deeper violence. The political universe that gave their judgments force had ceased to exist. This is one of the most merciless truths in institutional history. Law does not die only when buildings burn. It dies when recognized authority evaporates. An institution can survive inefficiency, contradiction, even ridicule for astonishing lengths of time. What it cannot survive is the loss of a credible center of obedience. Once no one believes that commands will be backed, mediated, or enforced, ancient legal forms can become archival remnants almost overnight. The psychological shock rippled far beyond Germany. For centuries, the title of Holy Roman Emperor had carried a fading but still potent memory of universal order in Latin Christendom. His practical authority had long been limited. The symbolism had long been mocked. Voltaire's famous line had captured a truth, but not the whole truth. The empire may have been weakened, but it remained a recognizable part of Europe's moral and legal vocabulary. Its disappearance signaled that one of the continent's oldest legitimizing structures had finally lost the ability to organize power in the age that was emerging. And that age was harsher. It favored concentrated sovereignty, administrative speed, fiscal reach, and mass mobilization. The old imperial language of layered rights, negotiated hierarchy, and overlapping jurisdictions gave way to systems that demanded clearer chains of command and more direct instruments of coercion. Europe was watching the burial of a medieval universal title in the very era when modern political forms were becoming brutal enough to replace it. Still, the act of August 6th must be understood in its proper balance. Francis did not choose freely in any generous sense. Napoleon created the conditions. French victories destroyed Austrian leverage. French diplomacy rewarded defection. French protection made secession profitable. In that respect, the dissolution was coerced. But coercion does not erase agency. Within a narrowed field of choices, Francis selected the least catastrophic one. He refused to sit atop a phantom constitution that could no longer defend its members, command loyalty, or resist French manipulation. Better to extinguish the title than allow it to survive as a French-managed relic. Better to abandon a dead universality than to expose Austria itself to further political degradation. There was tragedy in that choice, but not confusion. There was defeat, but not helplessness. Francis destroyed the empire in order to deny Napoleon the final symbolic conquest of ruling through it. And the consequences were immediate. The disappearance of the Reich did not stabilize Central Europe. It removed one of the old restraints on the struggle over Germany's future. Within months, Prussia would challenge France and suffer the devastating defeats of Jena and Auerstedt. The fall of the Holy Roman Empire was therefore not the end of Napoleonic upheaval. It was the clearing of the board for an even more violent phase of it. With the empire gone, Europe had to confront a larger and more dangerous question. What kind of order could replace a structure that had lasted for centuries, yet vanished in a single signature? The judgment, then, is not a single answer but a chain of answers linked together. The Holy Roman Empire did not fall because it was ancient. Ancient institutions can survive astonishing punishments when they still command belief, coordination, and force. It fell because, by the beginning of the 19th century, the empire had become an order rich in legitimacy but thin in executive power. For centuries, that had been a workable strength. It moderated rivalries, distributed authority, and prevented Central Europe from becoming the easy property of one dynasty. But an arrangement designed to negotiate could not easily compete with an age designed to mobilize. That is the first cause. The empire was legitimacy-heavy and coordination-light. It possessed rank, memory, law, ritual, and constitutional dignity. What it increasingly lacked was the ability to convert those things into rapid obedience across the whole German political world. In a slower era, that weakness could be masked. In an era of centralized administration, accelerated campaigning, and concentrated decision-making, it became fatal. The second cause was the transformation of power unleashed by the French Revolution and sharpened under Napoleon. This was not merely the rise of a gifted conqueror. It was the arrival of a harsher political grammar. States extracted more. Armies moved faster. War reached deeper into society. Sovereignty became less a layered inheritance and more a concentrated claim to command. The old Reich had been built to regulate plurality. Napoleonic power was built to exploit hesitation. That mismatch mattered more than any single battlefield episode. The third cause had already begun before the final act. The mediatization and secularization of AD 1803 were not technical reforms tidying an old map. They were a demolition of the empire's internal architecture. Ecclesiastical states vanished. Free cities were reduced. Corporate layers that had once made the imperial system dense, complex, and self-balancing were stripped away. Germany became easier to simplify, easier to reward, easier to dominate through selected clients. In other words, the empire was being made more modern and less imperial at the same time. The fourth cause was the campaign of AD 1805, culminating at Austerlitz. Ulm and Austerlitz did more than defeat armies. They destroyed bargaining strength. They exposed the slowness and friction of coalition warfare. They revealed that Austria could be strategically dislocated before its allies could fully convert intention into action. After Pressburg, Napoleon was no longer merely a military victor. He had become the effective distributor of status inside Germany. Once rank begins to flow from outside the system center is already dying. The fifth cause followed with brutal clarity in AD 1806. The Confederation of the Rhine did not simply rearrange borders. It transferred obedience. That was the lethal stroke. Empires survive when elites believe that advancement, protection, and legitimacy still flow from the center. They collapse when those same elites conclude that security and reward now lie elsewhere. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and others did not need to be fully annexed to be politically captured. Their loyalties had been redirected. Their future now depended on French favor, not imperial cohesion. The shell remained. The current inside it had gone. The sixth cause was Francis II himself, and this is where the final act becomes clearest. He did not choose between triumph and surrender. He chose between two forms of loss: preserve the title and risk allowing Napoleon to manipulate the old imperial institution as an empty ornament under French dominance. Abandon the title and preserve the Habsburg monarchy in a form that could still govern, survive, and fight another day. So Francis sacrificed the Reich to save Austria. It was not noble fantasy. It was cold dynastic realism. The signature mattered because it acknowledged what strategy had already decided. That is the layered verdict. The Holy Roman Empire fell because an old constitutional order lost the ability to align legitimacy with force at the exact moment Europe entered an age that rewarded states able to do both at once. Napoleon did not destroy a healthy organism. He exploited structural weakness, accelerated constitutional disintegration, redirected elite loyalty, and forced the Habsburg dynasty to retreat from the imperial fiction in order to preserve political reality. Its afterlife, however, was immense. The destruction of the Reich did not solve the German question. It sharpened it. The simplification of the map made later reforms possible. The humiliation of old powers encouraged new political thinking. National consciousness, administrative modernization, military reform, and the eventual German Confederation of AD 1815 all emerged in the long shadow of AD 1806. Even in death, the empire continued to instruct Europe. It left behind one severe lesson: age does not protect an institution. Only continued usefulness does. And beneath that lesson lies something even deeper. Human beings cling to symbols because symbols store memory, dignity, and belonging. But symbols remain politically alive only while they can still organize action. Once they no longer tell elites where loyalty should go, no longer tell soldiers what authority to obey, no longer tell subjects where power truly resides, even the most ancient order can vanish with astonishing speed. Outsiders call such endings sudden. History usually reveals something colder. They are sudden only at the surface. Beneath the surface, they have been unfolding for years. So the paradox of AD 1806 was only apparent. A 1,000-year empire ended with a signature because, in strategic terms, it had already been mortally hollowed out. The pen did not perform the execution alone. It recorded the final verdict. And that is the enduring warning left behind by the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. Institutions do not survive on prestige alone. They survive when belief, obedience, and power still reinforce one another. The comments are open for one precise verdict. Which mattered most in the final collapse AD 1803, Austerlitz, the Confederation of the Rhine, or Francis II's choice? Subscriptions here are for viewers who value history explained as strategy, systems, and human nature rather than costume and myth. And the episode waiting on the end screen continues that investigation through another decisive turning point in the making of modern Europe.